It is my honor and pleasure to introduce you to one of the most creative persons I know, Lashon Daley. She is, are you ready? A storyteller, scholar, dancer, choreographer, creative, including children's book writer, playwright, and producer. And she uses this broad array of talents to bridge communities together through movement and storytelling. Miss Daley studied English, creative writing, and journalism at the University of Miami before pursuing an MFA at Sarah Lawrence College. She then received a master's degree in folklore at the University of California, Berkeley. Get it? She graced our graduate program with remarkable intelligence, a strong critical voice, wit, graciousness, and a demand for more than boring academic writing for 2 years. Her thesis, entitled When Diane Tells Me a Story, skillfully weaves together an ethnographic portrait of an acclaimed storyteller, Ms. Daley's own personal narratives, and the story of their relationship in a work that is superbly written. We missed her when she left, but fortunately she stayed right here in the neighborhood, so to speak, beginning the graduate program in performance studies here at Berkeley. She is moving towards the completion of her PhD. Ms. Daley is also a 2015 UC Berkeley Chancellor Fellow and a 2014 Callaloo Poetry Fellow. Her work appears in the journals Signs and Meridians and in Dance Magazine, Storytelling Magazine, and, this is amazing, in Oprah Magazine. Now listen, I wish I had that kind of circulation for my work, let me tell you. She published a children's book, Mr. Okra Sells Fresh Fruits and Vegetables, in 2016. Her awards include the Emily Chamberlain Cook Prize in Poetry, the Mark Goodson Prize for Distinguished Theatrical Talent. Her teaching and mentorship here at Berkeley earned her a mentorship award from the Office of Graduate Diversity. She is the creator of Stories and Slams, a podcast that focuses on everyday stories. Lashon, I feel deeply honored to have the opportunity on the 14th of October, 2020, to continue the conversations that I enjoyed so often just 5 years ago, and now in a way that will enable many others to benefit from the rich perspectives that you bring to the work of Zeroniel Hurston and your own work. So welcome back.
Thank you. That was such a generous introduction, Charles. I really appreciate it.
It's you. It's all you. Now, a major focus of our conversation today will be your engagement with Hurston's work. But first, I gave you pretty much the sort of standard, formal, just the facts introduction. But maybe you could introduce yourself. Please tell us how you came to engage in this wide range of creative pursuits. And if along the way you could include a story that captures a moment that was particularly decisive, that would be wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, so much of my story starts where I'm from. You know, I'm from South Florida, grew up in Miami, and my parents immigrated from Jamaica. So there definitely is a long history of even kind of discovering who I am through this narrative of what does it mean to be Afro-Caribbean? What does it mean to have parents who immigrated from an English colony and then trying to make it in the US? And even so much of how I grew up, I wasn't very much a child who enjoyed reading. I was certainly a talker, but reading and kind of homework wasn't my ideal. I loved movement. I loved being outside playing with my brothers. I loved figuring out how to climb the tree well, right? I loved figuring out how to play the video games. So much of my young adult or young childhood was very much just like figuring things out. And in my mind, I'm like, why read when I have my own thoughts? I have my own ways of thinking, my own ways of processing. So I think very much as a child, just that kind of curiosity allowed me not to focus on what other people were doing, but just fully engage with like what I wanted to do. Where was I being curious? What were my interests? And I'm grateful that I had, you know, a mother who really allowed me to explore all of those things. So much of, I think, who I am as a scholar and storyteller and mover really began to develop in those early stages of childhood, where we were really allowed to roam free as long as we were back in the house by a certain time. We really had free reign. And also being the youngest of five, I had so much to kind of look up to and to watch and to figure out. And being the youngest of five, I have three brothers and a sister older than me. Watching them figure out their own lives, I had not only kind of performances of what it meant to be a child and also trying to figure out what that meant for me, but I was entertained by their own experiences in their childhood. So I would say for me, a lot of kind of the work that I do now really began in those early stages of childhood. What ended up happening once I graduated college, I always thought of myself as being a writer and wanted to move to New York. And once I had the opportunity to go to Sarah Lawrence to get my MFA, I was pretty gung-ho on being a writer and living that New York experience, thinking about going into publishing and remaining in New York. But my advisor at that time was like, you're going to get swallowed up here. She's like, I'm just going to be honest with you. You don't need to be here right now. And she actually encouraged me to move to New Orleans. It was a couple of years after Hurricane Katrina. And she was like, you know, you don't have to put your writing aside, but I want you to go get other experiences. I want you to just to see who you are as a writer. I was like 22, 23 at this time. See who you are as someone who's curious and go do something different. And she encouraged me to move to New Orleans. And I moved to New Orleans without like knowing anyone. I didn't have a job. I was applying to AmeriCorps positions to do rebuilding work. And so when I moved to New Orleans just kind of opened up this new realm of not only what it meant to be a writer, but also what it meant to be a Black woman in the South, growing up in a very kind of Caribbean-based community and society was so much different than having to like own my Blackness as a woman in the South. So that was really transformative for me. And my intention wasn't to leave New Orleans. At that point, my hope was to continue the work that I was doing. I was working with storytellers. I was working with just all kinds of people in the community, gathering stories about Hurricane Katrina, about post-Katrina, and yeah, just kind of gathering information about the South and New Orleans. And with that, I had applied to UC Berkeley's folklore program, thinking that, okay, well, I have enough of a basis to think through what does it mean to be a Black woman kind of storyteller or a woman who has stories to tell in the South. I'll get my degree, and I'll head back to New Orleans. And that didn't happen. I actually ended up matriculating into the performance studies program, have continued some of my work, but have moved towards more Black girlhood. But still am very invested about what are the stories that Black women are telling and continue to tell and to pass down, not only verbally, but also through movement, through song, through recipe, through eye contact, right? Through facial expressions, all of that. So that really was, I would say New Orleans was really a turning point for me. That began the work that became my master's thesis and the work that had brought me here to start working with Diane Ferlat, who I ended up writing my work about, who was from New Orleans. She was a storyteller, grew up in a storytelling family, was very invested in the Black oral tradition, meeting her here in Oakland, California, and then just following her all over the country, listening to her tell stories. I guess that was like the next step of kind of what led me to do the work that I'm currently doing. Yeah, so it was a long trajectory, but it all kind of like made sense and came together as I look back and see all of the steps that led me to this moment.
That's good. Well, I guess it was then partly my fault that your desire to stay in New Orleans was frustrated. I'm glad about that. But
yeah, you encouraged me to seek a PhD. Yeah.
well, I will say also, I'm so glad that you had such a good mentor at a crucial point in your life as you left Sarah Lawrence, because we learn more and more today with all of the obstacles that people face as they break through all sorts of barriers that, keep the academy less diverse than it should be.
Yeah.
There is nothing as powerful as the role of a good mentor, but really a good relationship between a student and a mentor. So I'm really glad to celebrate that. All right. So
Mm-hmm,
would
mm-hmm.
you please introduce us to Zora Neale Hurston? How did you meet her? Well, obviously through her writing. And how has she helped to shape both the work you do and how you approach it?
Mm-hmm. I was actually watching a video of Alice Walker talk about how she met Zora for the first time. And I feel a very similar connection to Alice Walker's narrative because, as even as a high schooler, I read Their Eyes Were Watching God and then read that text again in college and didn't really connect with it then. It was just kind of one of those required readings that you come across, that you discuss in class, and then you move on into other text. So it's really interesting to know that there was always these kind of touch points between me and Zora, but it didn't really hit home until I read Anthea Kraut's Choreographing the Folk, which is really about how Zora Neale Hurston is super influential in dance studies. And it was really at that moment that I was like, wow, Zora has so much to offer, not only to like theater, right, with her playwright, or with her plays, to literature with her work, to folklore, to African American studies, but also dance studies. And then so she just became this much more fuller researcher and writer than I had ever really thought of her as. I always just kind of kept her in the canon of African American literary studies, which again is important to my work, but because I didn't want to be settled there, I felt like grounding myself in Zora Neale Hurston's work there would keep me as like an African American literature person, because I had studied English literature as an undergrad and went to go get my MFA. But once I saw her as like a choreographer and a dance scholar, I was like, I'm done. Zora has me. Like she definitely has me. And so then in 2017, I was actually on a road trip with my sister. We went to Orlando to go to, like Disney World or Universal Studios. And I asked her on the way back if we can pass through Port St. Lucie to visit Zora Neale Hurston's grave. And so we went, and I just remember it was raining. It was like a really dreary day. And turning into the grave site just felt like such a powerful moment for me. It was also a really sad moment because even though there are now markers and there are all of these kind of celebratory parts to her gravesite, it doesn't look the way Walker talks about anymore, gratefully. But it still just felt so, I don't know, so off for what she's contributed to research and scholarship. And I left her 2 tangerines and I thanked her, and have just been, I think, on the path to try and incorporate more of her work, but also more of her methodologies into my work since then.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, let's maybe get to the methodologies in a moment, but since you really beautifully wove together your own story and her stories, maybe continue with that just for a moment. I think it's an incredibly important time to be able to return to Hurston,
Mhm.
but now more than celebration is required. I'm thinking about your description of the gravesite. I would like to link our conversation to one I had earlier this week with Professor Lee Baker of Duke University.
Mhm.
Baker has written that, in his words, African American scholars who forayed into the anthropological field of folklore immediately met with marginalization, thereby affording their work little influence on anthropological discourses of race and culture. He noted that despite Hurston's position as the leading Black U.S. folklorist, she was largely relegated to the periphery in anthropology. But hey, more than scholarly reputation was at stake here. She never held a permanent academic position. She struggled economically. She died in a welfare home, and she was buried precisely in that unmarked grave that Walker found. So I think we thus need to face the hard question. Have things changed?
Mhm.
In your engagement with Hurston, have you felt moments of identification also between the obstacles that she faced and the difficulties that you've had to confront?
Yes, I mean, sadly, yes. I remember I think it was one of the first times I walked into the anthropology library at UC Berkeley. And it really is kind of a proud moment when you think about all of the photos. I think they're previous chairs of the department. I can't remember all of the titles. But when you look and you see all of these photos, a majority of them are white men. And I think there was one African American male. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I'm not going to make it in this field. I mean, that was honestly my thought about if I choose to go anthropology, like if I choose to pursue my PhD in anthropology and consider myself and ground myself in this field, how do I even try to break through this notion that in order to be an anthropologist is mostly male and mostly white? And so, I mean, I really have to say, Charles, that I am really grateful that you encouraged me to think through performance studies as another method, maybe not as an entire different discipline, but definitely as another method. And so it was in those moments that I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, if I am going to get a PhD, where can I thrive as a scholar and a Black feminist scholar? And where are there opportunities for me to be able to see myself grow and to think through, like, what does it mean to use Black feminist methodologies as a part of my research? And I realized at that point that I wasn't necessarily going to be able to do that in anthropology. And so thinking more broadly about the humanities and anthropological research, I could also do that in performance studies. So for me, that was the moment in which I was like, okay, I can still do this work, but I have to be very choosy about what discipline to do it in and where I could thrive doing that. Even in performance studies, we recognize that, like, I was on a call with some faculty of our department a week ago, and we were talking about, okay, who are the foundational theorists and texts in performance studies so that we can really start thinking more broadly about diversifying the kind of scholarship that undergrads are reading in terms of the intro into performance studies and even grad students. And so much of the early writings of performance studies in the 1990s are, again, right, white scholars. And it's not to say that that isn't right. You know, I'm not trying to make an argument that whether that's right or wrong, but just because they are labeled as performance studies doesn't mean that there aren't other scholars who are doing performance studies work that's not labeled. And I think, again, going back to the greatness that Anthea Kraut was doing was like, you know, Hurston has been taken up in all of these other realms, but because she is a Black woman in dance studies and Black women in dance studies aren't at the forefront, like, how do we do that work? And I feel like it's in those moments of scholars saying, oh yeah, what happens when we do put people of color at the forefront that have been doing it? So that really gives me hope, but I mean, 100%, like, so much of my own anxieties is like, will I make it in academia as a Black woman? And will my research matter? And where will it matter? And who will it matter to? And how do I even think about formulating my work so that it's legible, you know, legible to people who may not see the value in the work that I'm doing now?
That's remarkable. Well, I am glad to say that at the request of the students who use the anthropology library in Kroeber Hall at the University of California, Berkeley, the photographs were removed, but still they're of the emeriti, of people who've retired,
Mm,
but now occupy another space. But I don't know that that means that all of the structures that, you know, placed white supremacy at really the core of anthropological practices, that doesn't mean that they've been dismantled. So I
right.
think that all fields now, boy, it's a wake up time. And of course, what's really sad is the number, I mean, in the field of folkloristics, Gerald Davis, John Roberts, so many folks who were saying for so long, Americo Paredes saying,
Mm-hmm.
this is white supremacy is at the core here. And you are continuing to marginalize not just scholars of color, but the critical perspectives they could bring that would transform this discipline.
Mm-hmm.
There are, you know, people who've recently graduated in folkloristics. Rachel Gonzalez Martin, who wrote, you know, the ways in which their graduate training made them feel as if their voices were less important. So, wow, there's your amazing. I mean, that's beautiful to think about those images, those moments that say, welcome, but not really.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you, boy, that's really tells us how much work there needs to be done.
Mhm.
And I will say that you're actually speaking in the core course, the introductory graduate core course in folkloristics, which you also took as a student a long time ago, which has always had a dimension of trying to be able to decolonize the profession. But, after all, as you say, for white males, there are some limits as to, how much they can be able to somehow direct this sort of process. So thank you so much there. Well, now let's get to those questions of method that you really wanted to
Hmm.
focus on. Back in the 1930s, when Mules and Men appeared, folklorists and anthropologists were busy cleaning. That was a term of Franz Boas, who was Hurston's teacher. Cleaning their folklore texts, fragmenting them into isolated units, and stripping away the clues to both the context in which they were performed and the complex and often exploitative ways that they had been collected. Hurston sure was different. We might say that approach was deeply ethnographic, but I worry that maybe we simply see her as a precursor, thereby imposing contemporary standardized understandings of ethnography on her work. So tell us, for you, what lies at the core of Hurston's ethnographic method, and how did his particular features shape Mules and Men and her other work?
Yeah, the first couple of lines from Mules and Men is that Zora went home. She went back to her people. She went back to her community. And the other thing that's really interesting about that is that she came, she leaves her community, she goes north, she gets educated, and she comes back home. So that there is this understanding that she did have an opportunity to get perspective about how to see herself at home and how to see her community for when she went back to do this study. So it is interesting to think about this concept of like going back home as a place to begin your research, because not only are you rooted there, but you also have connections there, right? I mean, the really brilliance of Mules and Men is that she is in her community. She's addressing people by their names. She is driving around in her car, making herself known so that everyone knows that she's back. And she's inviting people into her space, right? She makes them food, she gets them talking, she goes where the party is, she goes where the people are. And she does such a great job at eliciting their stories, right? She makes just really one request. I need some stories. Who wants to tell me some stories? And then from there, she just allows the stories to move and to grow, and from one person to tell a story into another story, right? She doesn't do very much, but in that not doing very much, she's doing a lot. And I think that's really the brilliance of Mules and Men and Zora's work, is that she allows there to be the flow of conversation and storytelling and narrative, but also she had to write this down. So it's not just that she had a video recording or even a voice recording and played that for us, right? She is also a writer, and she knows how narrative works, and she was able to use description and dialogue and narrate these stories in a way that they came off the page, that they actually perform on the page. And so I think there's just so much about her technique and her skill set that makes Mules and Men just seem so simple, because it's like stories being told by others. But she had to tell that story. She had to digest those narratives and then tell them again. And so, I mean, I think it's brilliant. I actually listened to it. A couple years ago, I read it. But having this conversation with you, I listened to it a couple times, and I was like, man, so much of this work is auditory and imaginative, like being able to close your eyes and imagine being in the space of the toe party, right? Like knowing, like thinking about the taste of the gingerbread and hearing the music. All of that is really performance on the page, and I think she was brilliant at it. She was innovative with it, and why I think performance studies has been such an important home for me and for my work is that it allows me to think through the kind of performative of language, not only just in thinking of the way in which we do research, but also what it looks like on the page.
That's wonderful. When returning home, one of the stories I like a lot in Mules and Men is when she describes a farmer and his wife who send their son off to become educated. And he comes back he went to college, only person from the area to go to college. And he comes back and he's supposed to know everything that he knows. And it doesn't sound like he really knows as much as despite his use of mathematics and science. And I wondered how she felt when that story was being told and whether they were kind of looking through the corner of their eye at her. I said,
Mm-hmm.
well, from thinking back, I mean, about that complex analytic machinery that goes into what seems to be a simple narrative, all of the major sort of foci that one thinks about today, dimensions of embodiment, of voice, performance, context, the way in which they're not fragmented stories, but in point of fact that there are storytelling events, but these entire events are pulled together, well, this happened in the juke joint last night, and I'm going to go there today, so I'm going to retell this story there. So many of these contemporary concerns, also concerns about multi-species, because animals are telling us what it means to be human and vice versa. And at the same time, so many stories that are about starving to death, right? About race and oppression. I mean, yeah, maybe all of that analytic was that came into the field decades and decades later, right? But which was mapped out there in that book is simply incredible. So tell us, how have you used Hurston in your own work?
Yeah, Hurston has taught me to be a really great listener,
Hmm.
especially doing the work of storytelling, and even more specifically, if I talk about what I was doing for my master's thesis with Diane Ferlat. It wasn't just about following Diane and listening to her stories, but it was also about just kind of listening to what the stories also had to say about what it meant to experience the Black experience or the Southern Black experience, right? Like even within those tales, tell us about what kind of conversations people were having, what kind of stories they were trying to remember, right? Especially with the Brer Rabbit tales, like there's so much of those tales that encompass culture and nuance of culture and nuance of listening. Brer Rabbit, I mean, especially was such a great listener because he was so focused on trying to always survive and trying to out-trick so many of the other animals, but he had to know his community well in order to be able to do that. So I feel like with Hurston's work and the doubling of storytelling from her being a storyteller and being a good listener to her community members so that she could hear these stories. Yeah, I've learned to listen. I've learned to listen, not just only in class, right? But I've just kind of learned to listen to myself about trying to figure out like how to do my work well and not always feel convinced that the scholars that I'm reading, who I'm told is the way to do this work, but to really listen to my research, listen to my work, listen to myself, and move through my PhD and my research accordingly. So if there's one thing, I mean, also being a good writer, right? But I would say if there's one thing I've learned from Hurston's work, it's about being a good listener.
Mm. Oh, that's a wonderful point. I really like that. Um, so what do you think today that we could learn from Hurston's ethnographic techniques rather than saying, oh, yeah, she did a long time ago and now we've got it all figured out? If we were to listen more closely to Hurston, how might modes of ethnography and also modes of ethnographic writing, how could they be transformed today?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to really think about how Hurston's work could really influence the ways in which we think about ethnography and performance, and even novel writing or even nonfiction writing. I think what is important is that she really was dedicated to her craft. And so I would say that if that's the one thing we could really think through and process, is that to be a researcher, to be a PhD, to be someone who's really committed to the work, you have to be dedicated. I mean, she was so dedicated to the point that it unfortunately kind of left her in a situation where she wasn't able to leave the work and go on to other things that may have allowed her to be more economically stable, right? She was just really committed to doing the research. And we see that even in the story when she's in New Orleans, and the priest is asking her to become a priestess. And for her, she's like, I can't, like, I need to focus on my original work, which was to get this stuff written down and to learn about it and to be involved and to be in the moment, but not to stay in the moment. She was always kind of on her next path. And we even see that in the Alice Walker essay about, she was in the midst of still writing. She was still very dedicated to her work and to her thought process. So I think, if anything, of what I learn is, to a certain extent, I wouldn't want anyone, especially researchers of color, to have to like live and die in their work and never see any profit from it. But what I do learn from her is that there really requires a dedication to the work. And if you can commit to that dedication, hopefully you get to see that in your lifetime. Hopefully you get to see your work blossom and grow and bloom and be influential. Like, I would love for every researcher who's committed to their work to be able to see that in their lifetime. But unfortunately, we see with Sora that wasn't the case. And that is really unfortunate.
Mm. That's a wonderful answer. Well, it's amazing to think about her also as being such a gifted storyteller, right? All those other modes of expression, as well as her striving to be able to reach broader audiences.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it's not just taking the same knowledge and extending them to other places, but it's other modes combining different creative modes of knowledge production that
Mm-hmm.
seem to me to be so important there. And frankly, a lot of us kind of get locked into a little typey sort of professional slot there. And certainly I think you and Hurston are wonderful models of suggesting that that's not really where the creativity lies. And certainly now the Academy has to change in the way in which it evaluates scholars. Because if collaboration, if community engagement, if looking for different ways, and actually looking for ways to make scholarship coming from people's lives, right? The concerns of people, hunger, racism, violence, and the other hand, to be able to make that research itself have an impact in people's lives. I think if we cannot come to be able to see that as part of what scholarship is, then, maybe it's time for scholarship to kind of move over and let the world go by. So I've got another question for you here. At this juncture, we're going to kind of go back to what you were talking about before, to the pictures up there in the library, right? To dismantling, right? All of those structures of power, of gender and sexuality, certainly of race and racism, and the blindness to anti-racist movements. Now, the white mainstream has woken up, and that's just wonderful. But it's like, this didn't begin yesterday. So how might Hurston's example inspire us to transform the very underpinnings of teaching, of research, and of work in other fields? In other words, what needs to be done, and how might listening to Hurston help us get on with it?
That's the $1,000,000 question, or maybe at this point, the $1,000,000,000 question, right? Like, how do we do this work well? As someone who is still in the program and someone is still really at the beginning of my work, right? Thinking of my dissertation that then becomes the book, that then allows me to become the scholar, that then allows me to be someone who somebody else cites or quotes, right? Like, being someone who is at the beginning of that work, I realize that it is a long trajectory. And how do we start to think about all the parts that will allow me, once I get to those stages of being a professor and being kind of a more public scholar, that allows me to do that well. But it also goes to say that, like, most people don't know the length and the time and the kind of perseverance that it requires to first get into a grad program, live and work and thrive in a grad program, to then get a job, to then get tenure, to then become this professor, right? Like there's so many stages to this process that a lot of people don't know exist. And so I think that there is this kind of easy, that there's a desire for kind of an easy, simplified answer of like, oh, just hire more people of color, right? But so much goes into even being able to sustain yourself in a PhD program, especially when the program is, 5, 6, 7, sometimes 10 years for people. So I think in terms of Hurston, what I feel like we could learn is that there has to be support from the very beginning, that there has to not only be support from the communities in which you are engaging with, but there also has to be kind of other financial resources and other ways in which we can, academia can help sustain researchers, right? Like, why wasn't she given more financial support? I know she had like a godmother, right? But why weren't there local colleges in the area, fellowships available to her? Why wasn't there like, probably even more government grants right at that time, thinking of, okay, it's not just about research, but all of the nuances of our culture, art that comes out of it, writings that come out of it. And so how do we start to see research and research within communities, research about communities that often aren't at the forefront? How do we really start to honor those communities and honor that work? I mean, I can say now that it is at the allowance of my department, and UC Berkeley, that does allow us to be more original and more have a little bit more leeway in terms of what kind of communities we can be researching and get funding in. But I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough. And unfortunately, I feel like Hurston really is an example of what happens when you're not supported. When you're really doing it on your own dime, when you're really trying to make it work. And unfortunately, it's only after that her work has become such a strong foundation for academia. And I mean, my one wish is that she would be able to see it, that she would know that she was so foundational to scholars like me and to so many disciplines. So I feel like that's a roundabout way of saying that, like, I wouldn't want anyone to experience the kinds of lack that Zora Neale Hurston experienced as a result of doing such good work. I think if there are ways to continue to support at all levels, that, also with teaching students how to do this kind of work well, that we could really blossom, academia could really blossom.
Mm. Well, this sort of phrase comes to my mind, which is that Zora's eyes are watching Lashon. I think that she would love to be able to hear your words about what you're doing, as well as how you've been inspired by hers. We're at a terrible, I think, and crucial juncture, because beyond the fact that we're people in the academy, we know that whiteness confers capital on white folks, just by being born white, in education and housing and jobs and health and so many other areas. And all of that is going on and affects students within academic settings. So boy, it's going to take a lot of work to transform it. And I want to tell you, I really appreciate you emphasizing your positionality in the broad temporalities of academic worlds. We've tried to, in this series, get some folks who are really well established in their careers, some folks like Alex Chavez, who's an assistant professor. And it's wonderful to have you look and imagine futures as well as pasts, positioning yourself right at that juncture where we're expecting you soon to be able to get that PhD and go off there and turn all of those wonderful ideas into, well, I don't know, just dances and choreography, into novels and other forms of creative writing, into scholarly books, into children's books, into all of those other things that you want to do. And I hope that the Academy will be able to learn how to appreciate the sort of creativity and breadth that you and Kirsten demonstrate. You're an inspiration. I'm always so happy to talk to you. Um, and I cannot thank you enough for giving of your time, your knowledge, your passion to us today, to the students in the class, but also to a broader audience. I hope that a lot of people are inspired, not only to go on and study, to write, but also to do it with that same passion.
Thank you, Charles. And yeah, thank you for also inspiring me and encouraging me as well. I mean, so much of honestly of your encouragement during that, those 2 years in the folklore program really helped me to progress to where I am now. So, yeah.
Well, then maybe I did one thing right in my life. Happy to hear that. Thank you so much. And I will, we'll be in touch.